Here we are with the next part of, why are we the only species of human on the planet? The Earth and human. As we will start right from, we left in last video. Let's start. The fourth and final species that we know we have shared our planet with relatively recently is significantly unspectacular as a fossil because these are the Denisovans. The Denisovans are a quite mysterious species living in Asia in Siberia in what Russia is now. To date this is pretty much the full extent of all the fossil material that we have: a little bit of arm or leg bone, a little bit of jawbone, and a few teeth from multiple individuals. Before learning more about the species, please subscribe to my channel, it will immensely help. So, it's quite hard to reconstruct this. All the data we have suggests that they were probably similar in kind of physiology. They were not very small, for example like the Flores species. We know from dating that they were definitely around at the same time as Homo sapiens. They were present at the same time, and we know that they are distinct from both us and from the Neanderthals. We have 4 species at least that were cohabiting on the planet at the same time, and our best guess is the wrong phrase. Our best information so far suggests a story that looks a bit like someone discovering new fossil material. All the dates change and a lot of the patterns of migration change. If you're watching this on catch-up in 6 months' time, it might be completely wrong. Go away and do a Google searching check, but as of today this is our view. The view is that around 600,000 years ago Homo heidelbergensis, you'll remember that's the jawbone that was reported from Germany we talked about in previous part, was a sort of most recent common ancestor of modern humans. Evolving in Africa about 600,000 years ago, and then from its African origins started to migrate out into Europe and ultimately into Asia. Once located in those parts of the world like species do and like those of you. It started to diversify, and it started to, in the normal process of evolution, accumulate mutations, accumulate phenotypic change. So physical change and natural selection did its work. The fittest organisms survived, and the unfit ones died out. So, for instance, the environment in northern Europe as we know is quite different to that in Central Africa. Not least it was a lot colder, and so selection started to act on these, and you ended up with diversification into what we now recognize to be a new species. The Neanderthals at the same time, these early pioneers over in Asia, were also under selective pressure. We're also diversifying in a different direction to become what we now recognize as the Denisovans. So those are the 3, and then the 4th species. We know very little about. Here he is down here, Floresiensis. We know from the dating that they were present on Flores about 74,000 years ago. We don't know at all how they got there or where they got there from, so we don't know, for example, whether these are direct descendants of any of these groups or some kind of parallel evolution or some kind of very mysterious migration from a different part of the globe. But they were nonetheless there. So had you dropped on the planet say 60 or 70,000 years ago and had a bird's eye view, you would have seen these different populations in these different parts of the world. Meanwhile back in Africa, Heidelberg, and this is of course not sitting unmoved. Evolution continues to work. Even if you're in the same place, and continues to select for traits that are beneficial traits, in particular like increased intellect, the ability to do things like use tools to coordinate hunting activities, and ultimately to do all the things that makes humans a great success. These selective pressures change the way that heidelbergensis look and ultimately lead to the evolution of what we recognize to be a different species. Modern Homo sapiens, modern humans, and the date for this arousal of early humans has moved many times, even the last few years we know. Modern humans were present in parts of Africa by about 300,000 years ago, particularly based on material from what is now Morocco, and that date again may move, but certainly by about this period. We had our organisms living in Africa that look very much like us and just like their preceding species. These humans started to spread and migrate to different parts of the world. Across down the Middle East into Europe and then into Asia, and when they did that of course they realized they had arrived in a place where there was already a human-like species. So, in particular in Europe, there's clear evidence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens entering Europe and meeting essentially the indigenous Neanderthals population that was there at the time. We have less material to that from Asia, but it's reasonable to expect we had a similar interaction with Denisovans and possibly even down with the Flores individuals in Indonesia. Modern humans have migrated out of Africa, they've come into these places, they've met all these other species by around 50,000 years ago, and completely by coincidence each of these other species then goes extinct. That feels a bit like a story. It seems a bit of a coincidence, doesn't it, that modern humans migrate out of Africa and one by one everyone who looks like us dies, and in particular if you think about the recent history of humanity. We don't have a very good track record about interacting with people in their own countries when we get there. If you think about early European settlers in pretty much any other part of the globe, that story did not end well for the people who were already there. So, for a very long time the rhetoric of modern human evolution assumed the reason of that the extinction of these indigenous species was a direct result of conflict with modern humans. In other words, we turned up in Europe, we spotted these Neanderthals and thought they were a bit of a pain and killed them and took their place. There are two reasons that that is probably not true. The first is that thus far we have no direct evidence of that at all, so for example no evidence of Neanderthal skeletons that have wounds inflicted by weapons. We have no evidence of mass genocide. We have nothing like that that might support that argument, and the second piece of evidence suggests we might have had a much more positive relationship at least with some of those. We don't actually know why those species all became extinct. There's no evidence that we deliberately eradicated them, but there are certainly several suggestions of things that might have contributed, probably in a combination, to drive these other species to extinction. The first is that this was a period of significant climate challenge, I guess, for these species. So, I don't know how well this comes across average global temperature going from long ago 800,000 years ago to modern day. For a long period of time between about 100 to 150,000 years ago and more recently of extended cold temperatures. So, these had two effects: one, the world was colder; secondly, it was also much drier. Because when the world is cold you lock up a lot of water into ice caps and everything becomes much drier. So, one possibility is this very extended period of cold, dry weather presented a significant challenge, particularly to those human-like species that were living in colder parts of the globe. In Europe, for example, denizens in Siberia may have struggled to deal with that extended period of cold. In a way that perhaps anatomically modern humans did not. There is also evidence at that time for several really large volcanic eruptions, particularly in areas like what is now Italy and down in the sort of Polynesian area and Indonesian areas that are likely to have produced a very large quantity of smoke and ash. Essentially, which has direct impacts. Obviously it's not very nice to live in a place where you've got ash falling on you, and also indirect impacts in terms of climate change in the local region. Most of the evidence now suggests this on its own is not sufficient to explain extinction, but certainly probably wouldn't have helped the humans living in those areas. A third possibility: infectious diseases, or that maybe this was some kind of horrendous sort of pandemic for these particular species. Perhaps even one that was precipitated by the arrival of modern humans. And if you think about that, for example, when Europeans arrived in the New World, they brought with them inadvertently, at first deliberately, later smallpox, a disease that was then endemic in Europe but was not endemic in North America, and therefore Native Americans had almost no resistance to smallpox. This disease absolutely devastated the Native American population. This is a pattern that happens a lot, so one possibility is that when modern humans migrated out of Africa, they brought with them perhaps some pathogens to which they were relatively resistant, having co-evolved, but these indigenous populations, never having seen it before, were very susceptible. So maybe they eradicated inadvertently Neanderthals and others by bringing their pathogens with them. A fourth possibility, and one which has had a lot of traction in the press, I think, is about the use of tools, and until fairly recently this was looking quite compelling. It was a really good set of data on anatomically modern humans creating really quite elaborate tools and using them to catch and butcher animals, for example, to do things like make early clothes. This was not something that was seen with other fossil materials, so the suggestion was maybe we were just technologically superior. We had these amazing tools, for example, hunt mammoths and other things. We always got the food, and Neanderthals starved out because they couldn't compete. That has been largely poo-pooed with more recent discoveries of tools that were clearly associated with the Neanderthals. Actually, the demonstration that the Neanderthals could produce equally elaborate tools and indeed had control of things like fire. So actually, that technological difference between modern humans and the Neanderthal is nowhere near as striking as it first looked, and is probably again not enough to explain this. We will continue to discuss this in new part of this series. Hopefully till now you are with me in understanding that why humans are the only species on the earth. To get the notification of new videos, and if you have yet to subscribe, please press the subscribe button. As I am working on the next part, meanwhile you can check other interesting topics and series already available. Thanks for watching.